Welcome to a new episode of TTG Conversations 5 Questions video series. In this episode, we'll be looking at how progress in COVID-19 management is impacting consumers' flight appetite. Taking us on this topic is Jameson Wong, APAC Director and Divisional Director of Hospitality with ForwardKeys. Now, Jameson has spent 13 years in hotels and travel technology companies and is now leading ForwardKeys' commercial growth and strategies here in Asia-Pac. ForwardKeys empowers companies operating in the travel ecosystem with real-time data solutions and predicts tomorrow's travelers through analyzing a myriad of data sets such as flight searches, flight bookings, air capacity, and consumer spend. Thank you so much for joining us, Jameson, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Karen. Pleasure to be here with you this fine afternoon.
Okay, great. So I've got 5 questions for you. Are you ready to begin?
Yes, go for it.
Okay. When Singapore and Hong Kong governments first announced on October 15 last year that a less restrictive bilateral air travel bubble was to be launched, ForwardKeys picked up, soaring flight searches and bookings almost immediately. But as we all know, the bubble burst before it could launch due to new infections in Hong Kong. And very recently, on February 1st, the Singapore government suspended reciprocal green lane arrangements with Malaysia, South Korea, and Germany for 3 months. So all that have exposed the vulnerability of such arrangements in the ongoing fight against COVID. So my question to you is, how have consumers responded to other news of green lanes and travel bubbles since?
Okay. I guess there's 2 parts to your question, right? First of all being, what do we learn and what was exposed through this whole bubble bursting experience? And then also how have consumers basically responded to such news of green lanes and, basically travel arrangements. So let's kind of talk about the first part first. What was exposed and what did we learn? The way I look at it is basically there are 2 groups of considerations, right? With this Hong Kong Singapore example, it's basically a concerted effort to enter into a controlled environment, right? It is what it is, right? A controlled environment where there was an acceptable level of risk. When that risk obviously went above a certain threshold, when there was no longer a controlled environment, that was when this whole bubble was called off, right? So first of all, we have learned that there needs to be at institution level a framework that consists of no less than 3 components, right? So the way I look at it is control environment, the risk tolerance, as well as the solution to the problem or cost of solution to the problem, right? And these needs to be harmonized before there can be any travel framework to be agreed upon, right? A lack of control with a low risk tolerance and no solution to the potential problem equals to a straightforward no-go, right? I don't think it's any, obviously exaggerating, but I don't think it's any different from us when we pack Imodium and we travel to India, for example. We accept the risk. We have a controlled environment of saying let's drink bottled water only, and we go, right? So it's obviously it's 2 very extreme examples, but conceptually, I like to believe that it's the same, right? So that's the first. We've seen that there needs to be an institutional level framework. The second one that I was actually looking at is basically at consumer level. There needs to be this balance. Actually, it's not even a balance. There needs to be a cost of travel versus rewards of travel, right? Yes, the government frameworks, the government arrangements, travel arrangements can be in place, but we as individuals would then have to decide and weigh whether the financial, the psychological, and the physical well-being cost of travel is it just worth the reward? Again, the financial, the psychological, and the physical well-being reward of trip, right? Because I wouldn't go somewhere where it's just not worth it, right? For example, I wouldn't fly over to Australia for 2 days just to come back into a 14-day quarantine, right? It doesn't make sense. However, I know of friends who flew just last week to Dubai for a 3-day business trip to secure a multi-million-dollar deal, knowing full well that when he comes back into Singapore, it's a 2 weeks quarantine, right? So it's all about, what works out for at the individual level, right? So that's the way I'm kind of looking at this whole Hong Kong Singapore bubble, and thinking back, what was exposed, what did I learn from it, right? So the bubble showed us that at institutional level there needs to be a balanced out aspect of control, risk, and solution, and then at individual level, one would need to have a convincible consideration to travel. Yeah. So that's to your earlier part of the question. Now to the later part of the question being, how have consumers reacted to travel arrangements since? The short answer to that is there has not been any significant resumption of travel in any way. That's what we see, right? And we link it back to the first point of, well, at institutional level, are there frameworks in place right now? Not that many, right? And at consumer level, does the rewards of travel outweigh the cost of travel? Unfortunately, if you look at it right now, by and large, the cost of travel still outweigh the rewards of travel, right? And based on the database of travel restrictions that ForwardKeys has kind of tabulated, we see two broad categories of travel arrangements currently. They are either for essential travel, so that's business or official travel, or unrestricted itinerary travel, and that's where leisure travel will fall under, right? Now, if you fall into the earlier category of needing to travel for essential reasons, then it's likely that you will go, and news of any other arrangements would not really matter to you anyway, right? If you are amongst the luckier ones who the later category applies to you, where it's an unrestricted itinerary travel arrangement, of which there are 4 in our region right now, between Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, Singapore, and Maldives. Then again, the cost versus returns of travel starts coming back into play, right? Out of the 4 leisure allowed travel arrangements that I've just mentioned, Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, Singapore, and the Maldives, only Maldives, we have been tracking positive responses. Not so much, little to no to none for Australia, New Zealand, for Thailand, and for Singapore. Okay? Little to none. I'm not going to say zero altogether. So specific to Maldives, again, it's a very interesting exercise because we've learned that the source markets that responded very promisingly, very, very, very passionately to Maldives opening up were source markets that do not impose restrictive conditions upon arrival, in Maldives. But however, equally important, they do not face restrictive conditions upon return to the home country. So, for example, where we were looking at the Russian travelers to Maldives, where they don't actually require quarantines upon return to Russia, in December of 2020, we were actually tracking a plus 68% year-over-year increase to Maldives, right? Similarly, for the UAE, for residents from the UAE traveling to Maldives, what we saw was a plus 60% increase year-over-year, right, in travel to Maldives, right? So I think it's important to note that it takes 2 hands to clap, right? You can't just say, I'm open, please come. You get some people coming. However, if they face an arduous journey returning home, then again, the cost of travel just far outweighs the rewards of travel in this case. Yeah.
So true, Jameson, so true. So did ForwardKeys see similar spikes in flight searches and bookings when news of government-approved vaccine programs broke? Are there specific regions or markets that have responded very positively to such developments?
Not as much, not as obvious as we would like it to be. However, we are not very surprised as well. So, news of the different vaccine programs around the world in our region did not actually generate spikes in, searches, in interest, and in flight tickets being sold, as compared to when the news of the Hong Kong Singapore bubble was announced. And the way I look at it is, again, going back to my earlier point, the vaccine provides for a solution to the problem, right? It lowers the perceived as well as the tangible risk of travel. However, there's still no clear control of the environment, and there's no framework that provides for travel, right? So again, still a little bit far out from being impactful to travel right now. However, to this point, one of the things that we noticed was that specific to Russia, we actually saw an increase in domestic travel in December and January this year after the vaccine program was rolled out. Yeah, so it wasn't an announcement, but when it was rolled out. In fact, between November and December, we were tracking an approximate 25 percentage points increase year over year, and this could likely be attributed to the fact that a Russian, or residents in Russia could travel restriction-free within the entire Russian territory. So they didn't need to wait for an institutional framework to be set out in place to allow them to travel. They could already travel. And with the vaccine, the solution to the problem, lowering of risk, I think it's likely that this was what spurred on the surge of travel domestically in Russia in December and in January this year.
Okay. Were there other developments that triggered a surge in flight interest?
Yes, interestingly, one of the things that we saw that puzzled us for 5 minutes, and then upon further investigation, we found out why. So in the midst of preparing for this conversation with you, Karen, for some reason, we noticed that there was a pickup in travelers flying flying from Vietnam to Singapore in the last 3 weeks of January. Right. In fact, the pickup was fairly significant to a certain extent. I was like, hey, doesn't look to be true, because I don't think we have any arrangements with Vietnam. I don't see any Vietnamese travelers. I haven't heard of anything. And so we dug further, and one of the things that we realized was this spike of Vietnamese of travelers from Vietnam traveling to Singapore were actually traveling to Japan via Singapore, right? And if you look at the timeline, that was basically when Japan suspended all of the travel corridors, imposed a state of emergency, and essentially closed their borders to all international arrivals, right? So it's highly likely that these travelers that were flying from Vietnam to Singapore were trying to rush back into Japan just before they closed their borders.
Right, I see. Yep. Okay, that's interesting. Could pro-customer initiatives by airlines encourage greater flight interest and confidence, you think?
Most definitely. However, coming back to your first question, it needs to be there needs to be two levels being satisfied, right? At government level, we need to make sure we have the right framework, and then at the individual level, we need to make sure that we have the right equation. And to your point, to this particular question, could airline pro-consumer initiatives encourage greater flight interest and confidence? Yes, because airline initiatives basically lower in one way or another the cost or the risk of travel to the consumer equation. All right. So, I'll give you two examples that we've seen, right, where the institutional level framework is actively in place, right, and it allows for travel, such as between Macau and China, as well as China domestic. We have seen that consumers, by and large, have reacted very positively to the airline initiatives. Right, we were looking at Air Macau introducing a deal where the traveling companion would fly for free, right? And guess what? 2PAX ticket sales year to date has actually the largest market share of all other PAX per booking segments, and is also the least worst performing, right, across the board, right? And if we look at the Chinese carriers since June of last year, when the situation in China was fairly contained as compared to what was happening outside of China, the airlines were basically they were launching different types of unlimited flight passes, right? And we know for a fact that was highly, highly successful. In fact, if I look at the calendar heat map of the entire year last year, every weekend between July and November, right, travel out of Shanghai was green. that there was a positive year-over-year variation, right? So it's highly successful. But then now I'll give you another example of the opposite, right? Where there is a disconnect between the institutional level and consumer level considerations, leading to little or no flight interest. So, no names mentioned, an Australian airline started selling, international tickets in Jan this year for travel to New Zealand, right, based on the expected travel bubble. And they also announced that they would open for sale flight dates after July 2021 for the rest of the international network, right? Because the CEO says that he expects the country to reopen, in 2 quarters' time, which is, a reasonable call, right? But then fairly, soon after, the government stepped in to say, hey, not so fast, right? And then guess what? Little to no pickup in ticket sales, right? So it really has to go hand in hand. Yeah.
Okay. What are the top 3 things destination managers and travel and tourism suppliers should do to make the most of recovery potential this year?
This was a tricky one. So having spoken with many different types of businesses across multiple segments within the travel and tourism ecosystem, right? I feel that businesses need to acknowledge that we are no longer in this temporary operating phase expecting to return to pre-COVID levels of travel in the coming months. In fact, I do not believe that we will be back to pre-COVID levels of travel within the next 2 years at best, right? At worst, maybe 3 to 5 years. I don't know. Nobody knows, right? But this means that, you can't just hold out for the next 3 months and expect, the second half of this year to be, back to Boomtown Charlie, right? It's just not going to happen. So businesses have to acknowledge that they are now having to revolve around, new conditions, a new type of travelers, right? And one of the most interesting things is that having worked again with many different segments operating in and out of the travel ecosystem, traditionally, 90% of them would focus, or rather most of them would focus, 90% of their resources and efforts trying to understand their customers who have walked through the front door, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. But, as obvious as it may sound right now, many of these businesses also do not realize that as different as they are, right? As different as the type of clients that they serve, at the end of the day, they are the same traveler. They are the same individual, right? It's the same Karen who is traveling today, booking a hotel, tomorrow in the airport buying duty free, the next day arriving in Yangon to cover what's happening there right now, right? At the end of the day, it's the same individual, right? And that leads me to my first point. You need to be highly aware of the visibility that the business have, that your business have of your clients, right? But also you need to be highly aware of the visibility that you do not have, right? Because it's obviously good to know what you know, but you don't know what you don't know until you know what you don't know. Does that make sense? Yes, it does. So, I would say visibility on a new type of traveler, visibility on what does this new phase of traveling means for your business, right? That's very important. That's the first point, and I want to drive home. And to kind of take bring it back a little bit to our business, which is to say, the travel intelligence scene has greatly progressed over the last 10 years. So information that you never thought was available is likely to be existing now, and also made available to your competitors, right? I'll tell you the number of conversations that I've had with, clients who go like, I didn't know that was possible. Like, yeah, it's been around, just that you didn't look hard enough, or there wasn't really that push to look for it, right? So go out and search for stuff that can help complement your organization's data, but also complement your organization's data capabilities, right? So for us at ForwardKeys, we're highly specialized in understanding the global traveler, right? When are they traveling? That's one of the things that we track. What are they searching for? Are they searching to travel? Do they have an intention to travel? Have they booked to travel? When are they traveling? what's their impact on the economy by looking at their spending patterns and behavior. All these sort of information, all these sort of data is available to us. These are things that can really provide the visibility that you did not have in the past to understand more about the new type of traveler, the new phase of traveling, so that you can get better prepared for the recovery this year or next year. Yep. So that's the first one. The second one, fairly obvious. Hate saying that, but not very often acknowledged, which is to say it is important to use high quality, reliable and relevant data to base your decision making or your planning off, right? It sounds highly logical, but the point needs to be made, right? A lot of times when I'm having a discussion with our clients or prospects, the notion of checking for or understanding the source of the data, the integrity of the data, understanding what the methodology behind it, the granularity, the recency of the data, it's not a very regular part of the conversation as much as I would like it to be, because these are important things to check, right? You can't just go out and rely on, dubious data to make your plans off, basically, right? That's that. Now, specifically, one of the things that sticks out is, especially what's happening right now, is that one would need to be conscious of the recency of the data. Now, the recency of the data, it wasn't as critical in the past because, you could still rely on the concept of same time last year, right? Whatever happened last year should probably happen this year again, right? Plus minus 5%. Yeah. You could still rely on data that was published reflecting on what happened last quarter or what happened last month. But you fast forward to where we are today, where things literally change day to day. You just can't afford to rely on data that tells you what has happened 3 months ago, right? So that's the recency of the data. Now, for us, that's something that we do very well. We pride ourselves on updating pretty much all of our database as much as we can on a daily basis, right? Because then that's the only time when we are able to very, very quickly and factually inform our clients and the public and the industry on what's basically happening, right? So that's the second part. The different attributes of the data, as well as specifically the recency of the data. Now, the last part to this question, what is the third tip?
Top thing that we should do.
Yeah, again, on the theme of data, it's that it is undeniable that right now we need to look into the future as much as we can, as realistically as we can, right? We need to be able to count on reliable and relevant forward-looking data to help us steer, basically what we're going to do in the coming months, in the coming weeks. It's essentially uncharted waters, right? So we've seen earlier on, in this dialogue, that providing the right circumstances, consumers will want to and have actually made decisions to travel, right? So it's highly valuable for travel and tourism businesses to keep on top of this, right, and keep track of what's happening. So one of the things that we've done over the past 10 years, fortunately we didn't start last year. We started 10 years ago, right, where we had this super aggressive R&D that basically allowed us to bring all of these different data sets together. We've been able to provide a unique perspective whereby we could rely on different data sets, such as flight searches, actual air tickets on the book, and by extension forecasts, to our clients to keep them informed on the latest happenings, as well as based off our most up-to-date knowledge, what's going to happen in the future, right? So I would say it's these three things. And frankly, looking back at the past year, we've been very, very humbled by our ability to swiftly respond to our clients' needs for data and insights when the outbreak occurred last year. Yeah.
Okay, that's all the 5 questions we have for you, Jameson.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for giving us your time.
Likewise, Karen. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
And to everyone, take care, stay safe, and we shall see you on the next episode. Yeah, goodbye.